is why is it permitted? So we're going to have two questions. We have two questions. We'll deal with one of them at a time. They are both about sex, so we group them together, but they don't necessarily have any interconnectedness between the two questions. One's about Shabbat and one's about in general. So if the reality is that on Shabbat there are many things that are prohibited, and the question goes, if you can't plant a tomato seed on Shabbat to grow tomatoes, why is it that we're allowed to do a deed that creates human life? How does that make any sense? You can't grow a tomato, but can you grow a human? How does that work? So they say a story of a guy comes to the rabbi, and he turns to the rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, please tell me, sex on Shabbat, is that considered work or is it considered pleasure? If it's work, you're not allowed to work on Shabbat, so that would be forbidden. But if it's pleasure, Shabbat, you're supposed to have pleasure, and then it would be something permitted. So what's going on? What is it considered?" So the rabbi gets lost deep in thought. He thinks, he's scratching his head, stroking his beard, and he says, after a few minutes, he looks up at the guy and he says, "You know what? It must be pleasure. It must be pleasure. Because if it wasn't pleasure, then my wife would have the housekeeper do it." It's obviously just a joke, but the reality is that, just to get us in the mood. So what's going on over here? As we said, with so many things that are forbidden on Shabbat, you can't plant a tomato seed on Shabbat. Why can you create the possibility for human life? Why is that considered permitted on Shabbat? So we have to remember what is considered work on Shabbat, what's not considered work on Shabbat, isn't just things that we decide of what we consider work, or what's not considered work, what's considered pleasure and what's not considered pleasure, and different aspects of that. But it comes from the Torah, it comes from the Bible. The Torah tells us, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, that we have to remember to sanctify the day of Shabbat. 6 days a week you have to labor and perform all your work, but on the seventh day is Shabbat, a holy day to God. So telling us, could you play somewhere inside or something because it's disturbing? So Shabbat, thank you. So Shabbat, so 6 days a week you perform all your work, but on the seventh day you should rest, you should not perform any work. So telling us to desist, to stop doing work, don't do melacha on Shabbat, would be like telling a 16-year-old driver that's just learning how to drive, getting his learning permit to drive safely. What does that really mean, drive safely? What does it really mean, not to do work? Okay, don't do work. What does that even mean? What constitutes work? What doesn't constitute work? So when God gave each mitzvah to Moshe, he also gave the definition and details of each mitzvah to Moshe as well, to Moses, and that this was not immediately written down, but it came along together with the mitzvahs, kind of the oral tradition that came along with it. And when it comes to Shabbat, work on Shabbat, how that really works is that God told Moses that there were different types of work that were done to construct the tabernacle in the Mishkan. Right after the Jewish people got the Torah at Mount Sinai, the next thing they did was they built a tabernacle, they built a Mishkan. And anything that was considered work in constructing this tabernacle was the first synagogue, if you will, first temple, the first traveling home for God that the Jews had in the wilderness. Anything that constituted work, anything we needed to do to create the tabernacle, those were the forbidden works, the forbidden malachot that were forbidden on Shabbat. And there's a list of 39, what we call avot melachot. It's 39 cardinal or parent types of work, which incorporate and include many subcategories, but ultimately there are 39 categories. And whatever those 39 categories are, that's what we're not allowed to have done on Shabbat. And included in that is planting, is reaping, is sowing, is baking, and many other things, shearing and catching animals, trapping, and things like that. And therefore, planting on Shabbat is forbidden because it's part of the things, the 39 works that were used to create the tabernacle, to build the tabernacle. But marital relations, sex, was not one of them. And therefore, it is not forbidden on Shabbat because it's not something that's listed in those 39 categories. And essentially, it's just as simple as that. It's not one of the 39 categories, and it doesn't get included in that, and therefore, there is no prohibition on Shabbat. The definition of melacha is limited to acts that were associated with building of the Mishkan. Reproducing offspring was not something that was one of them. So if you think about it, that seems like a very, very simple answer. So what do we think of the question to begin with? Where does the question even begin? So we have to understand that work on Shabbat doesn't mean how difficult something is, or how hard an effort is to do something, or work on Shabbat comes from the word melacha. Don't do melacha on Shabbat. Okay? What is the melacha? There's another word for work on Shabbat, or work in general in Hebrew, and the word would be avodah. The Torah forbids us to do melacha. The Torah does not forbid us to do avodah. What does that really mean? That means, for example, there are certain very difficult activities that you may be able to do on Shabbat that would technically not be considered breaking Shabbat, but it's still not considered work. Because what we constitute for work when it comes to Shabbat is creative work, is intelligent work, is work that you're trying to create something with. And intelligent work is something is considered work on Shabbat, and unintelligent work is not considered work on Shabbat. For example, breaking something down. If you're breaking something down just for the sake of destruction, that's not considered work. Whereas if you are breaking something down, you're demolishing to rebuild, that's considered work. If you're erasing something, erasing writing, if you're erasing it to be able to correct it and write something else, that's considered work. If you're just erasing for the sake of destruction, then maybe it's not a Shabbat activity, but it's not something that goes into the categories of work on Shabbat. So melacha means intelligent work that takes a craftsman, work that takes intelligence. And when it comes to, and not work that's difficulty. For example, if I could pile up a pile of books taller than me and schlep it around my house all Shabbos afternoon, and I may be sweating profusely, but I didn't break Shabbat. Shabbat was never broken because I didn't do any work. Whereas I flick a light switch, and all of a sudden I've done work. So it's not about how strenuous activity is, it's about intelligent activity. It's about doing something that takes a mindfulness or takes intelligence to make it happen. And so too, when it comes to sex, the reality is that procreation is not something that's limited to humans. It's found in all species of all of God's creations, and it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure it out. It's actually something that animal. It's something that's known and done quite intuitively, and not something that needs to be an intelligent work, so to speak. And therefore, it's not considered in our situation work on Shabbat. Okay, it's not included one of these 39 categories because there's nothing to do with melacha. So basically, we're talking about that malacha means a creative act that makes some change in nature that promotes a more habitable world. And theoretically, if you think about it, creating humans would include that. But the reality is, the reason why we don't include it, Rabbi, we would say that every melacha that we have requires a learning and knowledge to know when it should be performed and with which and how to implement it. Marital relations do not fall in this category because it is a more of a biological instinct. For the same reason, we would say that it's not you could say you're not allowed to grind on Shabbat. You're not allowed to take a wheat, for example, and grind it down to make it flour. So maybe you shouldn't be allowed to eat on Shabbat either, because when you chew, you're grinding the food down. But we don't say that. Why? Because that's not something that's a creative process, and a creative process in the sense where you sit down and figure out how to do that and come up with solutions. That's something that's more of a biological nature, biological instinct, and therefore we understand why procreation is not considered a forbidden act on Shabbat. So just the key points to answer this first question is the definitions of melacha is limited to an act which is associated with the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and things associated with it, and procreation was not one of those things. And second of all, a little bit deeper than that, is something that would constitute a melacha, work on Shabbat, requires learning and knowledge, and this does not apply to marital relations. There's no need for learning and knowledge around it. It's something that any living being can naturally, with biological instinct, so to speak, figure out how to get that done. Okay, so that wraps up question number one. And therefore, we answer our question, why is sexual relations allowed on Shabbat? Now, the question is, question number two, why does the Bible refer to sexual relations as knowing? That's question number two. They say a story of a rabbi that was a rabbi in a synagogue, and the synagogue had poor attendance. People didn't really come out. In the community he was in, people weren't interested. They'd rather go fishing Shabbos morning. They'd rather do something else more exciting. They didn't find going to synagogue too interesting or exciting. So the rabbi was thinking, he's scratching his head. He asked himself, how can I fill up the pews? How can I make people come out? What can I do to excite them to come out? So he decided to put out a flyer saying that this Shabbos the sermon is going to be about sex and Shabbat. And he promoted this, and they went around town, and all of a sudden Shabbos morning, everybody was interested. Obviously, this topic is something people want to know about. So the pews filled up, and sure enough, they start the services, they lead a service, and then they move on to Torah reading, and after the Torah reading, the rabbi gets up to give a sermon, and as he gives his sermon, he says, okay, so, my dear congregants, you're here for the sermon, the Shabbat sermon, so I want to tell you that, marital relations is something that two humans have, and it's something that a man and woman do. And then now, enough with that. Enough with sex. Now on to Shabbat. And he gave an hour sermon about Shabbat. Right? Just the kind of those two things. And he went on and totally unassociated. So this topic kind of brings people out. It brings people out. It makes people want to know, ask. And like I said before, this question has nothing to do with the previous question. It's on a similar subject. But we're putting them together just so. So why in the Bible, when the Torah talks about marital relations, when the Torah talks about two people coming together in sex, it uses the word knowing. As we see in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, It says, "Va'adam yada es Chava ishto v'atar v'telado es Cain." It says that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. So we see the Torah employs this, Adam and Eve coming together, marital relations, and it uses the word that Adam knew Eve. And the question is, why does the Torah refer to marital relations as knowledge, as knowing? So one explanation that's given is that the word knowing in Hebrew, das, means attachment. And in attachment, there are different forms of attachment. You could have intellectual attachment, which is knowledge, knowing something, you're connected to it, you're studying it, you're wrapping your brain around something, you are becoming aware, deeply connected to this piece of information, and therefore we call it knowledge, yad da'as. And so too you could have emotional connection, where there could be, and we also call that knowledge, where God says about Abraham that I know him, that he will teach his children and his descendants after him to go in my ways. And his attachment, his love for Abraham is called knowledge, knowing. So it could be intellectual connection, it could be emotional attachment, and it also could be attachment through love, and it could also be physical attachment through sexual intercourse. So this is the concept. Das means to become attached to something, and you could have this on an intellectual level, you could have this on an emotional level, and you could have it on a physical level. And that's why the Torah calls it das, attachment. There's a great rabbi, his name was the Nitziv, a rabbi in Lithuania, and he explains the concept like this. It's a deeper dimension, if you will. That, the concept of, in a couple, husband and wife, we have the concept of marriage. Right? Where does the concept of marriage come from? So in the Torah tells us that a husband and wife, a man and woman, shouldn't just come together and be together and procreate. The Torah tells us that a man and woman should come together and get married. Okay, and marriage is a process. You have a wedding ceremony, you give a ring, you ask for a woman's hand in marriage, and you get married. And if God forbid, for whatever reason, that marriage needs to be dissolved, then you go through a process as well. You have the divorce process, there's proceedings. Judaism, there's giving a get, a document that creates the divorce document, and separate. So the man and woman being together doesn't come in just in a vacuum. Just you decide, you're walking down the street, you meet a woman, you say, I want to be with you, and two people get together, but there's a process that takes place. There's a marriage process. Now, if you look before the Torah was given, you also have the concept of marriage. How did that work? What was the process of marriage before the Torah was given? How do we know there was a process of marriage? Because one of the 7 universal laws that were given to Noah says there shouldn't be adultery. And if there shouldn't be adultery, then adultery means that there was a marriage before. So how did it work before that? Before that, it worked that any man and woman that came together decided they want to be together, that let's be together, that constituted a marriage. So anytime a man said to a woman, you know what, I really like you, I want to be with you, let's get together, that would be considered a marriage. And once you were in a marriage, you shouldn't commit adultery. And let's say you wanted to dissolve the marriage before the Torah was given, then you just the husband would tell the wife, or the wife would tell the husband, I'm not interested anymore, let's dissolve this. And just their mere discussion, their conversation, was enough to designate them as spouses and designate them as now divorced and separated. The Torah kind of came on top of that and developed a much more of a process to it, not just something that you can walk down the street and do on the spot, but something that takes a little bit more of preparation, of creating. And the concept basically is that two people coming together shouldn't just be a random act, but two people coming together should actually be a thoughtful act. an act of building something. When you get married, you ask somebody, you want to build a family with me, you want to build a future together. It's something that's done in a much more all-encompassing way. And the reality is that sex isn't just relegated to human beings. This is something that's, like I said before, all creatures of the earth procreate. So what's the difference between a man and a woman coming together and a cow and a bull coming together? What's it have to do? What's the difference? Right? The difference is that with animals, so to speak, who the animal is, who the other animal is, and what they're about, and et cetera, et cetera. There's no great knowledge or depth you need to have about them. You have a male, you have a female, you mate them. And mating, that's possible just any male and female. You don't need anything beyond that. That's it. You got the parts. You're a male. This is a female. You can procreate. That's where it starts. That's where it ends. Cow doesn't have to know much more about anything else other than it has a male and a female. Whereas when it comes to human beings, yes, we can reduce ourselves if we want to just an act. And just, this is a male, this is a female, and, whatever. It's just an act. Nothing special, nothing more. Why are you making so much out of it? But ultimately, that's not really what a marital relations should be, and not what it's meant to be. Marital relations is not just an act. It's not just two people coming together and saying, you know what, let's just do an act. Let's just experience some pleasure. Let's just do something and walk away from each other. Really, it's meant to be something that's much more profound than that. And as we said before, that knowledge, attachment can happen intellectually, can happen emotionally, and can happen physically, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. That marriage, that on a human level, sexual relations, the Torah is telling us, is knowledge, is attachment. It's not just an act. It's not just about getting a deed done for pleasure, or whatever it is. It's also that, but it's really about coming together with somebody and connecting in a very profound way, intellectually and emotionally, and ultimately expresses itself in action as well. But that action now is much more profound and much deeper and much more satisfying and much more meaningful when it is an all-encompassing reality. When it's not just something that two people can do, just like any other creature can do, but it's something that two people are experiencing each other in the deepest and most profound ways. Two people connecting and being there for each other intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. And also, as it goes, physically as well. And that's why we call it in Hebrew, we call it Yada Das, which means knowledge. In marriage, we enable a deep, all-encompassing knowing in all spheres of our identities. So the key point, just to wrap up question number 2, the word knowing in reference to sexual relations means that we recognize the other as our spouse, and we sanctify ourselves, and they are sanctified through us to marriage. And when we approach sexual relations, an expression of knowing our spouse, that we get to know them intellectually and emotionally, we affirm its sanctity, and we're enable a deep, all-encompassing connection and create something much more profound and something profoundly human. That wraps up today's class. Tomorrow we'll be back. I hope you enjoyed. As usual, please comment and let us know where you're watching from and that you're enjoying. And if you have any questions, by all means, you're more than welcome to ask away. And thank you for being here. Tomorrow's question that we're going to be talking about is, why aren't vegan foods and vegan restaurants kosher by default? That means you have kosher restaurants, right? Obviously, when it comes to meat and dairy and things like that, we need to make sure they're kosher. But isn't vegan only plant-based stuff, and plants are all kosher? So why do you need kosher certification for vegan products? Why would you need kosher certification for vegan restaurants, shouldn't they just be kosher by default? Any place that's vegan, if they're truly vegan, I should be able to eat there no matter what. So that's the question we'll be dealing with tomorrow. Please join us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter and also on YouTube. So you can follow along in all of those places. On YouTube, you could find our channel at Chaim Lipsker. Okay, so if you go to youtube.com and you search Chaim Lipsker, you can find our channel, you can follow us, and you could be notified when we go live. It happens the same time as we go live on Facebook and Twitter as well. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. And as usual, through these days, we are doing our raffle, our annual summer raffle. It's a fundraiser that helps us keep Chabad going. And if you could please join or ask your friends and family to join, I would be very, very appreciative. We just crossed a third of the way to our goal. Our goal is to sell 1,500 tickets this summer, and we now are at about 550 or so, 547 to be exact. You can go and get some tickets at jewishucf.com/raffle. That's jewishucf.com/raffle. You can win some amazing prizes like $10,000, tickets for 2 to Israel, $1,000, $500, and $360. The good thing about this raffle is the prizes are not coming out of the money that you're buying tickets with. They're already covered, and every penny that you buy tickets with goes directly to help Jewish student life at UCF. Again, thank you for joining. Thanks for making everything possible, and see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow with our question for tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, and look forward to seeing you soon.